Hey guys, welcome back. So, Unit 1, Lesson 3, big focus here is going to be on the start of the Civil War. Today's lecture is going to focus on that very beginning portion of it. We're not getting quite into the battles yet, but we are going to be talking about Fort Sumter down in South Carolina. So, first of all, preview page, relatively simple activity today. Bigger focus is going to be your geography skills. So, you're going to draw this map of the southern states. And what I want you to think about is when I say the words border state, I want you to know what I'm talking about when I say that word. So, first of all, border state, the definition is a union state which touches a Confederate state. The border states would be these middle states here. So, you're going to have to answer the following questions. One, which states are border states before Fort Sumner? Which states become border states after Fort Sumner? And then, as a bonus question, what state is the Indian Territory? So you're going to be answering that. And if you have any questions about these, you can come talk to me about it in class. But you need to be thinking about what a border state is. So that's the key word. They're union states. They're northern states that are touching Confederate states. With both questions, it's going to be either the purple or the orange as a hint. All right. Going to move into our notes now. So turn to the right side. And first of all, we talked a couple days ago about the election of 1860, which brings Abraham Lincoln into office. And so Abraham Lincoln is elected president. He doesn't take office until March because back then, and the way the Constitution is written, the election's held in November, but the inauguration is not till March. By the way, today's inaugurations are held in January. So the gap between the elections and the inauguration has decreased. Why do you think that is? Well, more than likely because public transportation and transportation in general is much more efficient. They needed that longer gap, uh, you know, before, and now it's not as much needed. You can get to Washington, D.C. the next day now, but still, nonetheless, there's obviously that gap between November and January. But back then it was even longer. It was March. So, March of 1861, Lincoln becomes President of the United States. He, in his inauguration speech, will pledge there's not going to be a war unless the South starts it. He does not want a war at all. He knows that states are seceding, but he's kind of refusing to acknowledge that they're an independent country, and he's kind of hoping this whole thing will go away. But he knows realistically that it's not. But he's not going to start invading southern states. He's simply taking the policy of pretending that these states just this country just doesn't exist. This confederacy beneath him. Meanwhile, of course, though, the Confederates are very active at forming their new government. So they're going to start seizing federal branches. They're going to start seizing arsenals, military posts, these things in the South. And at the point of Lincoln's inauguration, they control, the Union controls four forts in the South. And so, as you can imagine, this is kind of an awkward situation because the South is supposedly its own country. And so, from their perspective, the location of these Union bases in the South is considered to be a another country on their own territory. This tension here is going to be a problem, and that's going to eventually lead to Fort Sumner, which you're talking about. By the way, these pictures on the left-hand side, well, the bottom left-hand picture in particular, that is actually a picture of Lincoln's inauguration, but his second inauguration 4 years later in 1865. And so I just think that's a very cool photograph because you see the Capitol building in the background, the same one that's there today. You can see some scaffolding up here, and Lincoln is down there giving his second inauguration speech. So I just think that's a really neat picture, but just my opinion. All right, moving on to the next slide. Fort Sumter, located in the state of South Kakalaki, South Carolina is the name of the state, though Kakalaki is a common way to refer to North and South Carolina, which, fun fact, goes back to when the military folks would get drafted from the bigger cities and they'd be relocated to the Carolinas for military training or for military bases, they felt like they were being relocated to the middle of the countryside, so they called it Kakalaki as a joke. Though today, obviously, both North Carolina and South Carolina are much more developed and less rural than they once were. Anyways, Fort Sumner. On April 12th of 1861, the Confederates attack Fort Sumner in South Carolina. The battle lasts only 34 hours, and the Union troops eventually surrender. Background information: prior to this, they were already running low on supplies. Lincoln was wanting to send supplies to them, but the South didn't want that to happen. They didn't want to keep this fort down in the South, so instead, the Confederates decided to take that opportunity to attack this fort. And so they attack the fort, and the battle's going to last about 34 hours. The Union troops surrender, and interesting thing about this battle, nobody actually died during the actual fighting, but one Union soldier was killed during the surrendering salute when a gun misfired. But with this is the beginning of the Civil War, because once again, we think back about our next slide. Lincoln said there will not be any war unless the South starts it. So this is the South starting the war, and the result is that the North is outraged and somewhat unified. Really, from the northern perspective, this is almost as like a terrorist attack type event, or like a 9/11 event. Like, everybody was shocked that the Confederate military attacked a Union fort, or that these Americans had the audacity to fire at their own fellow Americans in this battle. So this is the official beginning of the Civil War. Like I said, Lincoln claimed that there would be no war unless the South starts it, and this is the start. This is when it begins. So this is just a picture of Fort Sumner afterwards, and so you'll notice here that the Confederate flag is flying up above it. At this point, there's only 7 Confederate states, which is why there's only 7 stars on that Confederate flag. So keep that in mind. Also, you'll notice that it's not the flag that you see on people's T-shirts and bumper stickers on their trucks. So, as a reminder that the Confederate flag you often see displayed today is not the real Confederate flag. So, anyways, that's a picture of Fort Sumner from that time period. So now that they're going to be going to war with each other, it's important that we kind of compare the two with each other. And it's important to understand that you hear a lot of Southern apologists. They'll say, "Oh, the South had done this, we might have won the war," or something like that. That's complete nonsense. When you look at the numbers in relation to this war, from a military standpoint, the South really has no chance of winning. Population-wise, the North has a much larger portion of the population. They have the bank deposits. Wars are extremely expensive, cost a lot of money. You look at recent wars in American history. Both the war in Iraq cost over $1 trillion. The war in Afghanistan cost over $1 trillion. Wars are expensive, and that lack of money in the South is going to be a huge problem for their economy. They don't have any factories. You got to have factories to produce guns, to produce bullets, to produce everything needed for war. The South has cotton going for them, but as you're going to learn, they're not going to be able to trade it with anyone. So there's nothing they can do with that cotton. The North, even though people think of the South as being more agricultural, the North actually has much better food production than the South at this time period. The North also has horses, which horses are still a key part of fighting wars in the 1860s. The Confederacy does have a donkey and mule advantage, 71%, but you're not going to be riding donkeys and mules in a battle. You can use them to move war materials, but they're not particularly useful in that aspect as far as fighting goes. And then finally, the railroad tracks, especially important. That infrastructure, that existence of railroad tracks, that's going to allow the movement of people, the movement of weapons, the movement of food. Extremely important. So, population-wise, it's also important to consider that the slave states were very rural compared to the free states, which were becoming more urban very quickly, this is kind of the beginning part of the Industrial Revolution, which we'll be talking about in our next unit. In addition to that, you have the population by race to consider as well. The North is mostly white. The slave states are 66% white and 34% black, so about two-thirds white, one-third black. And I guess this is kind of misleading because some of the slave states were actually part of the Union, but still there's going to be two factors that go into play there. Slaves in the South are going to be rebelling against the Confederacy, which is going to hurt the Confederate war effort, and the Union is going to be trying to encourage slaves in the South to rebel. And so we're going to learn about later the Emancipation Proclamation and things like that. So if you look at that population there, the existence of these slaves in the South will be an opportunity to help stir up resistance against the Confederacy. All right, so you're going to be copying down this T-chart. Kind of sums up the things we just discussed. You need to understand these things. So make a little T-chart in your notebook, write Union advantages on one side, Union disadvantages on the other side. These Union disadvantages could also be considered Confederate advantages. So population, first of all, 22 million compared to 9 million. So 22 million in the North, 9 million in the South. And, when it comes to fighting wars, body count matters. And if you have more troops, that's a good thing. And unfortunately, back then, generals didn't really value the lives of their soldiers as much. So that's why this war was so bloody. And there were so many Americans who died because they were basically sent in line after line after line in these fights. And also lots died from the resulting infections and things like that. Healthcare wasn't as good back then. The North has a larger railroad system, as we discussed before, important for moving people, guns, food. Industries there for manufacturing guns, bullets, etc. And the better banking system because, once again, like I said, wars are expensive. They cost money. As far as the disadvantages go, they're going to be fighting within the South, which means, if we skip ahead a little bit, they're unfamiliar with the terrain. They're fighting in a territory that they don't quite understand. The South is more able to use guerrilla tactics, while the North is trying to retake territory, which is always a more difficult thing to do, at least in the short term as well as in the long term. Can be a more difficult thing to do, especially when you have factor number 4 combined with that. The South is highly motivated to fight. And so when you look on paper, I mentioned before, you look at the statistics here, and there was no chance that the South really could have won this war. But when you look at the statistics too, you also have to admit that the North was so heavily favored to win that this war really should have only lasted a month, maybe a year at the most. And it ended up lasting 4 very long, very bloody years. And that's because of the highly motivated South. They were ready to fight. They wanted to fight. They were very passionate about what they believed in, even if what they believed in was owning other human beings. They were quite passionate about it, and so they put up a heck of a fight against the Union, and that's one of the main reasons why this war lasts for so long. Finally, it's also important to understand that there was divided support for the war in the North. Not everybody was pro-Union, pro-get back the Confederacy. Some people really had the mentality, well, what does it matter? We discussed already that the owners of clothing manufacturing companies in the North, textile factories, they wanted slavery in the South because for them that meant cheaper raw materials so they could make more money from their clothing manufacturing. So there was divided support. Not everybody in the North was necessarily pro-Union. Not everyone in the North was necessarily pro-war for that matter. So that's going to be an issue in itself. But ultimately, the North is going to be much better off as this war carries along. Okay, we're going to wrap this up with our response activity. So you need to imagine you are a high school student, just like you are now, except you live in the Civil War area, and you happen to live in one of these border states here. Maybe you live in West Virginia, and your family member, your cousin lives in Virginia or Kentucky or something like that. You're going to write them a letter about the war. You live in the North once again, so they're in the South. You need to maybe try and convince them to come to your side or something like that. But you're going to talk about the war, how long you think it'll be, and how you feel about the war and some things like that. All right. Well, thanks for joining me today for another U.S. history lesson. You guys take care.